Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, once again. So we are going to go into our final day of this technical training, and once again, this is going to, fortunately for you and for myself, I guess, be good news, because it's also not as much presentation work as we did in the first day, but nonetheless, it is vitally important as part of the conversation, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of today's session, we will have a chat surrounding how everything will work from a certification perspective, examination perspective, and whatever other questions you may have. I do know that we have a mixed batch of customers as well as our partners that's joining us in this session. So it would be great to get some feedback and some questions from you to see how we can best help you, and obviously understanding the solution and moving forward. Right, ladies and gentlemen, just as a quick recap before we get diving into everything here, we talked about the deployment in the first day. We talked about the introduction of the solution and its entire operation together. In the second day, we talked about the actual technologies that is going to be used to defend and what it is designed to do overall. Now, today we're going to bridge very briefly into incident investigation, incident response. We'll talk about the sandboxing technologies, and then finally, maintenance and third-party integrations. All right. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's get cracking on this. So yesterday we briefly touched on some of the alerts that comes in into the KATA platform. Right. Now, as we saw, with each different alert, you're going to have a different set of information that will be represented, and different levels or different varying degrees of detail that will be added to it. All right. Now, when we talk about an alert coming in from an endpoint, it's important to understand that this is obviously going to be EDR related alerts. You'll notice that it says an endpoint as the source. Depending on the kind of detection, it is going to show us a varying degree of information. So for this specific instance, you can see that it is marked a TAA for the endpoint. So this is the targeted attack analyzer. And when we have a look at more information, more events about this, you'll notice that it has an IOA ID, as well as, of course, just adding the host to this as well to make the search a little bit more concise. Now, from here, we can find out more information. We can see the frequency of how many times this event has populated for this device. This is where we need to go in and we need to investigate and understand, is this something that is a normal process, a normal procedure from a user? And if so, we need to go and create an exclusion for this, right? Because we want to limit the amount of events or alerts that's being generated by the system, so that we have concise data that helps us to representatively, obviously, investigate on the things that's most important. So apart from this, on an endpoint detection, we will see much clearer information on an alert. All right. So for example, here we can see the threat formation chain, and each one of them can be expanded and modified and shown in different varying ways. But the most important part is that we can do in-depth investigation into what it is that's happening, right? Because that's exactly what EDR does. Our endpoint detection response is focused on understanding exact activities on these devices, what connections they make, what processes they start, what services they start and create, what registry modifications they make, any files being dropped or modification to existing executables. All of this information is necessary as part of your EDR solution. All right. Now we can track the chain of events by expanding them, as I just mentioned it to you, and we can click on either one of them, on any single point inside of this chain, and we will find all of the exact details about it. Right. So for example, if we clicked on this particular detection here, it will show us the MD5 hash, the SHA-256 hash, any launch parameters, where it was initiated from, so that's the event initiator. We can see the scanned detection, we can see the last action. So what's cool about this is the EDR also integrates into your endpoint security from Kaspersky. So this means that we can see what was the action taken by our endpoint security, if any, on that particular endpoint, right? So we can see that insight, we can see that information, we can conclude our investigation. And from here, we can take a multitude of different response actions, right? But just to come back to the point that, you know, we need to investigate the quantity of alerts that's generated by single systems, because some systems do perhaps something from a service perspective that can be considered as suspicious, right? And this will trigger something like targeted attack analyzer. And we need to investigate and verify and validate that this is legitimate activity so that we can add something like a TAA exclusion to this system. This helps us to reduce that overall amount of alerts and quantity of alerts so that we have a much more accurate representation of true alerts, right? Okay, now when we create these exclusions, we can create them for single devices, single files, single activities or actions. That's what's nice about the threat hunting tab, is you've got all of the operators available that you can use to create a very concise rule, a very concise exclusion as well, to go ahead and exclude what is not necessary. And it is advisable to obviously investigate this during the first month or so of operation inside of the system, right? Now, we can manage these exclusions by going into our exclusions area as part of our settings. And from here, you can see the varying degrees of exclusions. So scan exclusions, IDS exclusions, and TAA exclusions, right? And we can use the query builder from both a detection perspective and an exclusion perspective, which helps us significantly. So as you can see, you've got these drop-down little boxes that's available where we can select and create our own queries that we otherwise would have needed to write in the manual format, such as displayed in the source code over here. So from here, we can then go ahead and we can add filters, add exclusions, add detections, create our own IOA rules, or even import IOA rules from a third party. So the query builder and the threat hunting is a very valuable tool for any security analyst inside of the environment, right? Now, we can create these custom IOA rules, right? So if you've created a massive search string or query, and this is something that you would like to reutilize moving forward, or perhaps even include as part of a standard scheduled scan that takes place, you can go ahead and do that directly out of the query builder. So when we create something like a new IOA rule, we can give it a proper name, we can modify its importance levels, its confidence levels. Obviously, importance implies how severe it may be, and confidence implies how confident we are that this is either very severe or, you know, maybe it's a 50-50 percentage that it's either going to be clear or not clear, right? So that's going to help us to go ahead and set up those kinds of things, all right? Any questions on this, by the way, ladies and gentlemen? Obviously, this particular course is not designed to be a full incident investigation or analyst-specific training. We do have an analyst-specific training for KATA itself, so that you have an opportunity, if this is something that's necessary, to go through something what a SOC analyst would need to go through from a training perspective. This is primarily just giving you some of the insights surrounding the solution, but obviously there is an analyst part to this as well, if that is something that is required. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, next up is incident response. Now, the response activity is primarily handled and considered by the endpoint detection and response. KATA itself cannot respond much. The simple reasoning behind this is the majority share of response activities are going to take place on endpoints. So what we can actually go ahead and do is do things like isolation of device. So if we find devices that is considered promising from a perspective of containing malicious activity, we can then go ahead and we can isolate these devices from the network. This is going to isolate them from both the local network as well as the internet communication, which ensures the activity or the possibility that we are going to, maintain or isolate or remove the device from a possible further infection. Right. But similar to something like our EDR Optimum, for example, we have the ability to set up exclusions as part of our host isolation. So we can set up exclusions based on IP addresses, based on ports. So these are kind of things that you would need as a security analyst to be able to properly and appropriately respond on any specific device. So for example, I can go ahead and I can create an exclusion specifically for this isolation to exclude something like remote desktop protocol on port 3389 from this IP address, right? So that I can have a remote access into this device and further my investigation directly on the device instead of, relying just solely on third-party systems. Okay. Now, similarly, another response activity is execution prevention. Now, execution prevention can allow us the ability to block or stop executable files, scripts, Microsoft Office documents, documents in general, and this can be created from hashes. So this is either MD5 or SHA-256 hashes, where we have the ability then, using that signature, to go ahead and prevent the execution of certain files or certain activities or documents. Now, this is usually done during what we call the threat containment phase, or the investigation or pre-analysis phase. This is done for the sole purpose of limiting the possible spread of a malicious file or malicious activity taking place inside of the organization, without then, limiting full functionality of a device, but still considering it useful for analysts to conclusively identify the verdict of any given file or suspicious activity that was detected. All right. Now, you do not have to do this just purely based on a reaction, because what we're doing, or what we're seeing here, it is an alert or event that was registered in our system, and we can see that this activity was considered service execution. So I will react by creating a prevention rule and or isolating the device. But we can do this proactively as well. So I can bring in an entire list of things that I want to go ahead and exclude up to 50,000 signatures, taking into consideration, once again, the possibility of having some national organization that is, serving up and analyzing the entire country's data, the entire vertical's data, to identify some key vectors that we want to ensure that is being prevented against inside of our own organization. Right. So from here, you can either import it or you can create these rules and regulations yourself manually. That's completely up to you. But in general, we give you that flexibility and give security analysts the ability to have a more flexible approach to really dealing with these kinds of threats. Now, another response activity that is possible is kill process using PID. So let me explain kill process first. It's probably pretty straightforward to understand. By killing a process, it means that I've got the ability using EDR to remotely stop a process that's currently running on any device inside of my organization. As long as I've got the necessary key identifiers, I can then say I want to block or stop this particular process from running on a specific set of hosts or all hosts inside of my organization. But that is going to be for the parent process. What do I mean by that? If you open up your Windows Explorer and Task Manager and you go and have a look at the running processes, you will always identify something like svchost.exe or explorer.exe. Now, cyber criminals, they know this. So what they will do is they will create malicious activity that hides under those parent processes. So I can't stop explorer.exe or svchost .exe from running, because that will crash my entire operating system, right? Or it will just prohibit it from running. So instead, what we do is we have the ability to then kill using a process identifier. Now, this is an identifier that this can also be a sub-process that is seen quite commonly with complex malware, where they will act as svchost.exe, but it will be a sub-process of that. So it will just utilize the same parent process, but in general, this is something that is obviously not safe. So we can then specify something like the PID, and we can see PIDs of activity over here. So here we can see the process identifier 696, or what's that, 695, sorry. No, it's 696. Apologies, my screen is a little bit small. But nonetheless, so we can then specify the details and say that I want to not stop svchost.exe, but instead I want to block svchost's sub-process using this process identifier, so that we can, go ahead with our remedial steps or whatever the case may be, right? Next up is the ability to get a file for further analysis. Now, by getting a file, what does this mean? As I've mentioned to you in the very beginning of the introduction of this particular training, I mentioned to you that the Kaspersky KATA sandbox has the ability to automatically submit its own files, and this is done via this the central node, to submit its own files for further analysis in the KATA platform's sandbox. But it's not being done for every single file found in your system, because that will just purely be a waste in a real world scenario. But this still leaves us with the opportunity as the security analyst to have that capability to submit files for further analysis, even if they haven't been automatically submitted, right? Now, by doing this, what we have the ability to do is go ahead and we can download files from a device that we are suspecting of being infected. We can download that device to the central node repository, right? Or the storage, basically. And with this, you can then simultaneously submit it to be further analyzed by the anti-malware engine, the sandbox, and if you have any Yara rules as well, right? So then it will be analyzed there, and you can then take that insight, take that information to further your research, your remediation steps, or whatever the process is that you're busy with at that time. Right. We can also go ahead and we can quarantine and restore files. Now, by quarantining a file, we're not deleting it completely from the system. We're basically removing it temporarily so that we can conclude our investigation to determine its true nature, right? And after we are done, we have the ability to restore that file back exactly to where it was found on all of the devices that you've removed it temporarily. So that's the quarantining capability and the restoring capability of the EDR platform as well. So here you can see, for example, restore file from quarantine. We specify file details, and there you go. And this is the first time that you're seeing this as well as part of a presentation. And it's the ability to run a variety of different tasks, either proactively or reactively. So for example, get data. Get data, as you will see a little bit later on, is everything ranging from getting PCAP files to getting system templates, to getting images, to downloading files, and so on and so forth. Then you also have other actions like kill process, which we explained, Yara scanning, service management, so I can stop or start certain services as part of devices. I can run a specific program or script or command using PowerShell command prompt or anything other than that, which further enhances the capability of the solution, because I can pretty much pre-deploy any sorts of incident investigation, incident response tools already into the devices that I have, and I will then be able to go ahead and run them when necessary. All right. We can delete files, quarantine files, and we can restore files from the quarantine. So for example, by deleting a file, what we can go ahead and do is if you find something that is considered an artifact of an infection, we just specify the file path, and if you even want to be a little bit more precise, you can add the signature, so the MD5 or SHA-256 hash. You can do so for all devices, for any specific devices, depending on your requirement. We can pull or get data, right? Remember what I mentioned about the get data. For example, we can get forensic information such as process lists, auto points lists, auto run points lists, sorry. File lists, we can check all local drives, directories, we can get any specific data, we can exclude certain areas, we can specify a particular scope, we can specify this for a particular device. The same thing goes for example, service management. In service management, we can then say we want to stop, restart, or start a certain network, or I almost said network agent service, but any specific service that's on a device can either be stopped, restarted, or started, found on that device using this platform, right? So if I wanted to stop the network agent service, such as what you can see over here, running on Alex desktop, this is exactly what it would look like, right? I can create these tasks to take that action on the devices. Similarly, from a service perspective, we've got the same capability for running programs. So here we can see we are just running PowerShell and we're running the argument GSV. And the description of this, I'm just adding as get services. So for example, using PowerShell on that device, it will then get the necessary services for this device so that I have more insight, and all of this is done remotely, right? So not only is the system going to allow us to get all of the necessary alerts and insight to be able to do a thorough investigation, but we have a variety of different action activities that we can take on those devices, as well as response and proactive measures that we can put in place. Okay. So in this particular case, ladies and gentlemen, before I proceed any further, any questions up to this stage before we go further with the different tasks that we have available? We only have one question here, and the question is, what is the argument? So the argument is basically the command that is being issued by whatever process or application it is that you specify. So in this particular instance, we are specifying that we want to launch PowerShell.exe. But by launching PowerShell, I'm not doing anything, right? It's not doing anything for me. Similar to command prompt, if I run who am I, or netinfo, or a dir command, I would need to specify that as an argument, because otherwise I'm just going to start command prompt and that's it. No response, no action, no activity, nothing whatsoever. So for things like PowerShell, command prompt, for other scripts and for other applications, you have the ability to then add additional arguments to said application. So I'm not just going to start PowerShell. I'm going to start PowerShell and I'm going to issue the command or argument GSV, right? And this is going to provide me with a result in a clear. This is the services that's currently on the system. So that is the argument. Okay, so moving on from here, ladies and gentlemen. Now, part of the forensic, we've got a couple of different get data options that's available. So here you can see we can get forensics, NTFS meta files, registry keys, process memory dumps, disk images and files specifically. Now, depending on the kind of information that you're intending to retrieve, you will be required to also submit some form of shared path. So as you can see here, this shared path is used as a storage location where the device in question, so for example, here we can see that the scope is only for Alex Desktop. Now what Alex Desktop is going to do is it's going to provide us with some forensic data. This data needs to be stored somewhere, right? So what we're doing is we're adding a storage location, which is a network file share that is publicly accessible. But we specify also the security. So basically the username and the password combination so that we, from this device, and I'm just going to add the lines here, from this device can access that shared folder. So basically the device itself is going to perform the action, but the storage of that particular action is going to take place perhaps on a file server or something else, right? And that is what we have specified here, right? Now, that's only for certain activities or certain actions that you take. So for example, if I get a disk image, the disk image is considered a proportionately large file. Now, I'm not going to take a disk image and just the exact same infected or potentially infected device. I want that device to share it to another device, right? So this is exactly what we're doing here. Now, when we do a get disk image, for example, this info and this insight needs to be added so that we have a comprehensive, let's say, task, right? But for example, for a disk image, we can either get logical or physical information, right? So ladies and gentlemen, sorry, I just need to one phone call, keep me to 5 minutes, and I'll be right back. My sincerest apologies for that, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, so I just needed to quickly take a urgent phone call, but that's sorted nonetheless. So hopefully we can continue the story here. So as you can see, we've got the ability for a get disk image, for example, to be both logical and or physical. That's completely up to how you want to do it. You can split the files themselves into certain parts as well, which is very necessary sometimes for storage measures. Then to continue this discussion, as you can see from here, we can also get registry keys. So if we wanted to understand a full list or a specific set of registry keys that's been added to a particular system or values that's been added to a particular system, we can go and pull that information directly from the EDR. So I'll give you a good example of why this is very necessary. So for example, if you have certain complex pieces of malware, so for example, if we'll talk about malware that is considered persistent, I'm not talking about an advanced persistent threat, but instead a persistent threat just in general, it will have the ability to modify and manipulate the registry keys in the operating system so that it launches itself every single time that it restarts or reboots that particular system, right? And the only real way to identify this is either through the EDR telemetry, number one, and number two is by running something like a get registry key list, right? So this is going to provide us the insight necessary to identify if there's any auto starts, auto runs that's been added from a registry perspective on a particular system. So this is very useful when we are doing an investigation onto a particular device. Then we can also run the same thing for NTFS meta files. So having a look at log information, having a look at the boot information, secure information, the journal information, and so on and so forth. So this for me and for you perhaps may be absolutely gibberish unless you're of course a security analyst, and it's not. But in general, this is the necessary information that we use from an investigation perspective to conclusively identify insight and activity relating to complex attacks, complex breaches, right? So getting the necessary insight is absolutely key for any investigation to succeed. And we need to be able to get this information as quick as humanly possible, because we all know in this field of cybersecurity, the longer you wait before you deal with something in particular, or the longer you take to identify a threat, the more damage is potentially going to be caused. So we need to be able to do these kinds of things as part of our investigation stages, so that we know how to proceed moving forward in our recovery stages, in our response, right? So overall, the tasks themselves can be one and varied. It can be proactive, it can be reactive. There's a couple of different options, as you can clearly see, that you can choose from depending on what is necessary, what is required, and you can create your own template-based reports, template-based tasks to be able to accomplish something similar across the board on multiple devices or one particular device, depending on the investigation process that you're busy with. Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the conclusion of the tasks. There's only one left, which is going to be the get file task for our sandbox analysis. But up to this point, do you have any questions relating to any of the tasks or activities that we've mentioned so far? Alrighty then. Now, moving on. The sandbox itself is a fundamental part of the KATA platform. This is integrated into both your networking side as well as your endpoint side, and it plays a key role in its overall superiority when it comes to the detection possibility and by ruling out false positive information. Not only is this done in an automatic fashion, as we've already explained, but it's also being done in a manual fashion, in a reaction, if you will, and that is up to the security analysts. Now, later on, we will also identify and see that we have the ability to integrate the KATA sandbox into third-party systems that utilize API. So, for example, one of the customers that I've dealt with in the past, they have complained that their security team is inundated with all of the employees sending them emails, files, applications, and so on to check and verify if this is legitimate or not. Now, this is a good practice, obviously, in the organization, but it's completely understood that the security team feels a little bit overwhelmed because now they need to deal with all of their day-to-day operations, but they also need to verify and validate if certain things that's been received into the environment is considered safe to inform the employees in question. So, for example, in API integration possibility, what we have done was, well, they basically set up a local intranet, basically, with an internal web server. This internal web server is basically a very simple, straightforward little website where internal staff can visit, where they can upload a file or a URL, something similar, and they will then be able to execute files or invalidate their verdicts depending on the sandbox's verdict, right? So because of this API, the users have the ability to check themselves and identify a verdict if something is safe or not safe using the platform itself. So this is one of very many different examples that can be used of how useful an API-capable sandbox on-premise can actually be. Right. Now, with that being said, if we have a look at sandbox alerts, these are typically going to be the alerts that contains the most amount of information. And it's quite simple. Why? Because the operating system is managed by Kaspersky. The applications, the network connections, the processes, everything is managed by Kaspersky, which means that we can provide a much more detailed picture of exactly what is happening when that particular file or files is being detonated as part of the segregated system. Because remember, your sandbox is ideal to be situated or segregated from the rest of your internal network. So naturally, with this being said, you can either utilize just the pre-designed, pre-created operating systems that Kaspersky supplies, or you can customize your own and add it as part of the testing group, basically. So, for example, certain malicious software will target Windows 7 operating systems, others will target Linux-based operating systems, others will target Windows 10, Windows 11 operating systems. And hence, this is exactly why the sandbox comes equipped with the sandbox virtual machines that it has at the moment. Because we need to take into account the architecture, we need to take into account the differences between a variety of different threats. Because one malware is perhaps going to do or get a certain result in one operating system, but in the next, it's absolutely going to be useless, right? And we need to identify this. We need to identify that information. We need to understand this. What is the differences between the Windows 7, Windows 10 virtual machines, and what is possible with the malware itself, so that we know, once again, which operating systems to protect, which kind of additional protection measures we need to put in place for a group of devices running a certain operating system version. All right. Now, in general, when we do a sandbox analysis, it will provide you with full login mode and information in a much more comprehensive manner. You can do quick scan mode, which collects a little bit fewer details, but still simulates the entire monitoring procedure. And in this particular instance, from an automatic submission perspective, meaning when KATA decides, okay, this is something that I need to submit, it will be based off of the anti-malware engine and anti-malware module to basically decide, this is something that we haven't seen before, we don't have a reputation on, but its activity is considered something that could potentially cause harm to the infrastructure. Based off of those sets of criteria, it will automatically then be submitted for further analysis in the sandbox. Now, when a sandbox analysis is concluded, you will have the ability to see, once again, a full-fledged view, a visual representation of the entire kill chain. Every piece of activity, every piece of process and service and registry and network connection and everything in between will be shown, because we monitor the entire virtual machine, right? Not just only certain aspects. And this is a key role in identifying some of the most complex threats. Now, part of all of these complex threats, the network activity is going to be sometimes at least one of the most conclusive pieces of evidence, right? Because generally speaking, with complex malware, complex threats, it has the ability to communicate out to the internet, which is quite standard actually. But where it communicates and what it shares, that is the true insight. That is the true capability of finding out what is going on. What is the severity level of this threat? Because this happens frequently. Kaspersky detects more than 360,000 new and unique threats every single day. Now, if you think about 360,000, that sounds like a large number, right? But comparatively, if we take only 5 of those 360,000 threats and those are considered or designated as complex or unique or targeted, that is still a massive amount. I mean, if you go and have a look at the list of current advanced persistent threat actors in the world right now, that's still a very relatively small number, but the damage that can be caused with their activity is significant. Okay. Now, obviously, when we look at things like full log activity and so on, we can see things like the activity lists, activity trees, the IDS activity logs, DNS activity logs, and so on and so forth. But we can also download the full log. And we could also go ahead and download the debug info. And the debug info is truly going to be the coup de grace, if you will, of all insight and information that you can possibly obtain from any form of detection technology out there. It contains everything from, dropped files created during the sample execution, process memory dumps, memory buffer dumps. It's going to contain screenshots. It's going to contain PCAP files. It is going to contain reports and additional insight and information that is useful and valuable for any security analysts to go through, right? And this is the only real way to identify, defend against super complex malware that's entering an organization. Now, the likelihood of you getting attacked by complex malware is generally lower than common malware, obviously, because usually these attacks are quite targeted. So just because it's a smaller organization with a smaller quantity of devices to infect doesn't negate the risk, because maybe you are connected to a larger organization in some way, shape, or form, which means that you can potentially help the attacker to infiltrate a much larger organization. So this is all valuable insights, all valuable information. Very recently, I had a discussion where we talked specifically about small to medium enterprises that consider themselves to be excluded from these levels of attack. And they consider themselves excluded from the outcome of these kinds of attacks. It wasn't us, we didn't attack you, but we indirectly led to your demise for a larger organization. So then we said, and we talked about the topics of what should larger organizations do when they engage in some form of partnership with other and perhaps maybe smaller organizations, right? And some of the primary things that will come up if you take any manual or any book that is on a shelf and you read through practices, the best procedures to follow, one of the best ways to really make sure that whatever partnerships you have has the best intention at heart from a cybersecurity perspective, that is to conduct frequent audits, have a set directive, a set deadline, a category of security that needs to be applied by a particular partnership business, provides either services directly to you or indirectly to your customers as a larger business. And it's completely reasonable to understand. I mean, in certain countries, there's obviously a lot of governing laws and governing regulation that stipulates certain things need to be put in place. For example, South Africa has something called POPIA, which is the POPI Act, as normal people say. That's just the protection of personal information. In the UK, you've got GDPR, right, which is basically ensuring the exact same thing, making sure that the data stays within the borders of the country for privacy and security reasons. In Saudi Arabia, they've got the same kind of directive. In Iran, they've got a similar kind of directive, right? So it's all across the globe, and businesses need to adhere to these requirements, and also this is for the protection of the individuals that they serve at the end of the day. So needless to say, sorry, I got a little bit off track there, but needless to say, the information that can be provided by something like a comprehensive sandbox solution such as this is going to be key and vital for any form of investigation and response activity to be done. And maybe, very maybe, you may actually have some form of attribution, right? And attribution is the most difficult thing to do sometimes. Keep somebody accountable, identify who is behind a certain attack, right? But nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, any questions on anything that I've mentioned up to this point before we go into the very last section of this particular training? Alrighty, so let's go into the 7th and the final section of this particular training, and that is regarding KATA platform maintenance, API integration, third-party integration such as Seam, talking about some of the activities that we haven't touched on just yet about the platform, right? And we'll start it off with VIP devices. Now, what is a VIP? Generally speaking, a VIP is somebody that you would see in your mind's eye that says, I need a red carpet to walk out. Right? I'm special. Now, in every business, in any business, you have a certain level of hierarchy, and it's done so for a very specific reason, of course, but I'm not going to go into that. But as we know from a security perspective, the higher you are up on that hierarchy, the more access, the more potential your account credentials could potentially have, or the risk of infection you could have that could lead to an entire organization being infected, right? Think about your CEOs, your CFOs, your CIOs, and so on and so forth, right? Talk about team leaders, management, heads of departments. These kinds of individuals, generally speaking, will have higher potential or access inside of the internal corporate systems. So they are highly sought after by cyber criminals, because they know that instead of me breaching the lowest ranking individual in the organization and I'm going to have very limited access with those credentials, I'm going to go for the highest, right? Or somebody higher that has more access, more privilege inside the organization. Now, this conversation can very easily lead to something like a zero trust conversation as well, but we'll not go too far from the path. In general, in the KATA platform, when we talk about a VIP device, VIP devices can be set up based off of a variety of different metrics, such as IP addresses, email addresses, host names, and so on. And the purpose of this is that if an alert should come in that is relating to a VIP specified device, this will go directly to the senior security officers only. Junior security officers will not have visibility into those alerts, the details. And you can also set up notifications and alerts for specifically VIP alerts. So if any VIP device, email address, IP address, or something like that is considered as part of one of the alerts, we can get a direct notification about this so that we can immediately investigate. Right? So in general, when we talk about VIP alerts, I've mentioned to you that a senior security officer is going to be the only one that has access to fully view that particular alert. So on the bottom side of the screen, you can see a normal security officer that's signed in, and it will have a blue star on the left-hand side to say that this is a VIP alert. Okay. Now, as a senior security officer, you will obviously see the same star, but you will have visibility into the alert details themselves, right? So you can actually investigate and remediate and work on it accordingly, right? So just to quickly answer one of the questions that I see in the question section, what is the abbreviation for TIP? TIP stands for Kaspersky Threat Intelligence Portal. The threat intelligence portal is an umbrella term for a variety of different services and capabilities that we offer with the help of our TIP or threat intelligence portal. Right. So I just wanted to quickly answer that question just before I forget about it later on. Now, VIP alerts can obviously be very useful in any kind of organization. The next topic of discussion is going to be passwords for archives. So the solution has the ability to go ahead and actually extract or, basically pull out information from extracted archives. But some of these archives may have a password or a PIN or something related to it. Now, in a scenario like this, if your organization uses a standard set of passwords for archives, for example, you can list up to 50 different entries or passwords that the system will try to use to extract the insight or the information as part of that particular archive so that we can extract it, test it, verify and validate that it's safe, and then basically send it on its merry way. Right. So that's another capability that it has. Now, that brings us to the discussion of API. Now, API, more specifically, RESTful API allows us the ability to integrate a variety of different systems from different vendors to perform actions and activities in an integrated fashion. So giving the opportunity for something like you mentioned earlier on, such as an internal web server, to basically submit files directly so that users don't need administrative accounts to be able to perform certain activities such as verify or validate if something is safe or not, right? So this is one example, but there's also other examples of other systems that can be used with the API for further analysis and identification. So document submission websites, right? So for a lot of organizations, perhaps maybe banks is going to be the best example to use here. So a lot of banks will give their users the opportunity to submit things like proof of residence, submit their salary certificates, loan applications, and these kinds of things through some form of online dashboard. But we cannot conclusively say if those files are going to be safe, right? So in this case, you can integrate something like those kinds of websites into the KATA sandbox, and the KATA sandbox will run through those files, detonate them in a secured location, and obviously provide a verdict. And based on that verdict, the file will either be uploaded to the file server or it will be deleted, right? That's one of the other examples that we can use. But nonetheless, when we set up an API integration between the KATA platform and any other third-party or external system, it is necessary to have an encrypted certificate between these two so that there's an encrypted communication between the third-party system and the KATA system. And this is usually done through something like generating a UUID for the API. And then we need to go ahead and we need to specify and share the corresponding self-signed certificate, generally speaking, so that there is an encrypted or secure communication taking place between the two systems so that they can integrate. Now, some of the use cases or use examples that you can use with regards to API is doing things like file scanning, getting scan results, outputting information about detection, so providing more insights about certain detections, receiving a list of especially endpoint agent hosts. By the way, if you're intending on writing the exam, take note of these things, right? It's just coming to me now. These are the kinds of things that will be asked most definitely. So if you're intending on writing the official examination, take note of these kinds of things. So the API use examples, if you're going to do something like gets or whatever the case is, these are some of the opportunities that you can bring in, right? Obviously, it will be completely different depending on your requirement, depending on your application and your request, what kind of information it is that you want to receive. But generally speaking, these are just some of the examples. Okay. That brings us to reports. Now, the KATA platform itself has obviously a varying degree of dashboards, depending on the kind of information that you're looking for. But you can also go ahead and you can set up reports. Now, these reports can either be pulled on request manually, or they can be shared on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, whatever the case is. So the first thing before we can pull a report is to create a report template. Now, a report template, ladies and gentlemen, is basically what you want the report to look like, what information it's supposed to provide you, and obviously the scope is the only thing that's going to change. When I say scope, I'm talking about the actual time frame of information. So I can create my templates to show me one particular thing, and I can just change this the time frame from I want a week's worth of information, a month's worth, or some specific date range, or whatever the case is. But inside of the report generation report template generation tab is the ability to drag and drop, bring in pie charts, tables, images, add or remove certain columns from tables, modify text, modify a variety of different things. So when we do these kinds of things, we will then be able to use those report templates. You can see that there at the top right, we selected the template weeks. So this was the report template that we just generated. But from there, you can see that I can just go ahead and when generating a report, I can specify certain KATA servers, so primary or secondary servers, as well as a specific time frame, so that this information can be presented to me. So this will be presented to us in HTML format, but you can export this to PDF as well and CSV as well, I believe, but I need to make sure about that. You will also be able to send mail notifications. So above and beyond reports, that contains obviously a summary view of a lot of different information. We can also set up email notifications. Now, email notifications can be set up for the solutions administrator as well as the solution security analysts. For example, I can set up email notifications about the status of how the solution is functioning, if any of the systems are showing errors, and that will go to my administrator. I can set up notifications based off of VIP personnel from a threats perspective, and I can send that to a specific user. I can also modify the subject information, right? So what we need to do is we just need to specify the server connection details, specify the email from. Hopefully at that time you already have an account created for KATA, but nonetheless we can then go ahead and we can say that for notification rules, I want to receive notifications about any threat that is detected by the sandbox, or any threat that's detected by Yarrow rules. These will generally speaking be considered your highest priority, highest confidence levels as well. So these are definitely something that we need to investigate urgently. But of course, you can set up your own rules and regulations regarding this, right? Second to this, we can also send the alert details through to a scene provider. Now, our software uses syslog as a default. Now, syslog is pretty much supported by any scene provider out there, right? So anything from QRadar to Alien Vault, Spunk, and so on and so forth, they all support syslog. Now, this means that we can just supply the credentials and the details if necessary for the communication, and that information will then be shared with the corresponding scene provider. Right? Now, this is a standard practice in large organizations to have a central information and event management system, i.e. a scene. So in that case, we will then be able to see everything in a central point of, okay. And for those of you that's running something like Nagios and you want to use SNMP, you can also go ahead and you can set that up as part of the configuration. So you can go and add SNMP traps, SNMP integration in general, for further information alerts in data. All right, ladies and gentlemen, any questions? This will pretty much serve as our very final slide of the technical training. And obviously, the reason why we have a 3-day training, I could have easily completed this entire presentation for you in 1 day, plus giving you some extra time. But the purpose that we have this training in 3 days is to give you much more opportunity to actually work with the solution. And considering sometimes its complexity, it is understandable and it may take a little bit longer, right? Hence why we use 3 days, right? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm giving you a final opportunity to ask me questions surrounding anything and everything that I've presented on over the course of the last 3 days. So please, now's the right time to ask these questions. Obviously, after this, we will have our break and we will proceed on with the final labs, and then that will be pretty much it. Now, before we start with our labs and after the break, I will first talk to you about exams and those specific details. But for now, any questions, it's heartily welcome. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so that brings us to the close of the session pretty much. So obviously the next steps is going to be your labs.